Good afternoon. There's a very interesting statement here in Joel's chapter no and. It's about dehypnotizing. If we can be made to believe that there is a mortal material universe, we too are part of this hypnotism. If we can be made to believe there is a mortal material universe, we are part of the hypnotism. So he's saying that only in a state of hypnotism do we believe there is a mortal material universe, and that when we are dehypnotized, we will know that there is no mortal material universe. Now, there are 4 different healings of blindness in the Bible, and therefore we can look at them with the idea that they are presenting to us different degrees of hypnotism in which individuals symbolic of the entire human race believe there is a mortal material universe. And these different healings of blindness then would be stages or degrees of lifting the hypnotism. And under the visible pretense of merely healing blindness, there must be keys to lift us from our blindness to spirit. These must be keys to illumination. And so let's look at all 4 healings at one time to see the similarities and the differences in degrees of the blindness of the human mind. We'll look first at the one at Matthew. I think we'll read them all together so that we can see how they compare. The first one is in Matthew 9, and it's just a few verses, 27 to 30. Remember where they take place, because the place is often indicative of a degree of consciousness. This one takes place in Capernaum, I believe. When Jesus departed thence, 2 blind men followed him, crying and saying, Thou Son of David, have mercy on us. 2 blind men. Thou Son of David, have mercy on us. Remember, they followed him. And you remember that means that they were coming to an inner understanding of the presence of Christ's identity. They followed him. The Master had said, Deny thyself, pick up thy cross, and follow me. They weren't sitting and begging, they were actively following Christ within. Where were they seeking their healing? Of Christ within. They were asking Christ. They were turning to Source. Now, as long as we have human fathers and human mothers, we go to them. When we have a divine father, we go to the divine Father. When you have accepted spiritual fatherhood, you seek the spiritual source for your good. You go to the Father within. That's the importance of having a spiritual father, that you will turn to that Father within. And this is what they're doing. And when he had come into the house, the blind man came to him. The blind men came to him, and Jesus said unto them, Believe ye. Believe ye has to precede a healing. Believe ye that I am able to do this. In other words, is there within the individual the acceptance of a spiritual source? Do you believe that you are the offspring, the expression of spirit? Do you believe that spirit is your identity? Believe ye that I can do this. Now these men are blind. How many blind people in this world would go to an individual and say to that individual, open our eyes? Only those who believe in the power of spirit. Only those who have some inborn understanding of their own spiritual identity. Only those perhaps who know that spirit has never made a mistake. There are no errors in spirit. Being lifted out of material consciousness would be the alleviation of blindness. The belief then in the presence of spirit and the perfection of spirit is implicit in the statement, do you believe that I can do this? And I, of course, is not Jesus. Do you believe that spirit in you is perfect now? That's a rather simple distillation of all the truth we've learned, that spirit in you is perfect now. And beside spirit in you, there is no other. Once we have come that far, we can see blindness as a state of mind rather than a state of body. The body merely being a reflection of the state of mind. In fact, every healing reveals states of mind. What we call adultery turns out to be the adulterous state of the mind which beholds what is called adultery. Those beholding adultery are beholding the adulterous state of their own mind. Those beholding disease are beholding the diseased state of their own mind. Those beholding limitation are beholding the limited state of their own mind. Always the outer picture is the fabric of the mind that beholds it. Those who are in blindness are beholding the blindness of their mind to their soul. Are those who can see blind to their soul? Just as much. There are different degrees of blindness to the soul. All of mortality is now revealed as blindness to the soul. Mortality is blindness. Mortality is a state of blindness, and this is the purpose of the blind healings, to reveal that mortality is a state of blindness. And you will find, as you slowly review all the healings in the Bible, that Jesus Christ was not healing an individual of a thing or a condition, but was healing the human race of its belief in mortality. He was healing one thing, mortality. That's the only disease there is. It's the only problem there is. It's the summary of all his work to heal mankind of the false belief in mortality. Little signposts along the road, different diseases, different problems, always raising the dead, raising the mortal from the false sense of mortality. Christ in you, then, says to the blind mind of you, do you believe that I can reveal to you the kingdom of God? Do you believe that I can reveal to you that there are no conditions unlike the perfection of God? Always Christ in you is speaking, and the outer appearance of a blind man is always the mind of you, which is blind to that Christ until something in you says, yes, I believe you can show me these things. And now Christ in you takes you out of a human mind. Christ in you transfers you from the human mind to the Christ mind. The lack, the limitation, the conditions are in the fabric of the human mind, seemingly objectified, but there is only one mind, the perfect mind of God. Christ in you lifts you out of your thought, your conditions, your beliefs, your sense of mind, which outpictures a world of matter. Your sense of mind, which is the blind man, totally hypnotized, and then opens you to the mind of God in you, which now reveals to you there was no lack. It was a lack in your limited state of consciousness. There was no death. It was a death in your limited state of consciousness. There was no heart attack. It was an attack in your limited state of consciousness. And every flaw in our human sense of life we discover to be only a flaw in the mind that still believes in itself and has not dissolved itself to rest in the one perfect mind. In your contemplation, when you rest in the one perfect mind, there is an acceptance that God being here, the mind of God is here, it is perfect. You know that every human image is a projection of the world mind, and you know that the divine image must therefore be a projection of the divine mind. The you man, the shadow man, the you of a man is not the divine man. It is the shadow image from the world mind. And in our human mind, we come into that circuit in which the human image is accepted as a person, an individual, but it's never a divine image. And because it's only an image perceived by the mind of man, it contains all of the flaws in that mind, all of the conditions, all of the beliefs. That fabric is transferred to the objectified image called man. And so you rest, knowing that there is another image present, an image in the divine mind, which has no flaws because there are no flaws in the divine mind. And your contemplation is merely that here is the one perfect mind of God. There is no other mind. I rest that mind, the mind that has been blind to the one perfect mind. And that releases all of the conditions in that mind which is showing forth in the outer image called the you man. the shadow man, the you-man image. Your contemplation lifts you into the one perfect mind. It's a slow process, a quiet process, but it's a renewing process. And this constant renewal, this constant reminder that the one perfect mind is here, means that it must be projecting its own perfect divine image, which is the self of everyone. This fact can never be pushed aside, even by the blind human mind. The kingdom can never be removed by man's unawareness of its presence. Our blindness to the invisible kingdom here doesn't remove that kingdom. It merely shuts us off from the enjoyment of it. One perfect mind now, and slowly that permeates your consciousness until you find you are not thinking with your mind. You're letting that perfect mind be your mind. So that your mind will express that perfect mind as a one continuous expression. And whatever is thought in the divine mind will become thought in the mind you call your mind. It will be one thought continuing to express, projecting its own perfection into consciousness. It removes the illusion that is in the fabric of the limited human mind. It removes the sense of a heart attack. It brings light. It enlightens. And that light brings with it the end of the material sense of consciousness, the dream consciousness. The light removes the darkness of the dream consciousness. And as you rest in one with the perfect mind, it reveals very quietly the present perfection of the invisible. There are no counter thoughts, no opposing thoughts, no troubled thoughts, no human thoughts. Just the one divine mind being itself, governing all within itself without a second. And without realizing it, the second self of you disappears. The one self of you expresses without a second. It comes forth as an improvement in the human scene, because layers of false mentality are wiped away. The dream consciousness is broken. You awaken from the dream of a human self, a human mind, a mortal being. And though you are not aware that you have done all this, it has been done for you. And you say, oh, I feel so much more at peace. Every time you become conscious that the one perfect mind is where you are and you rest in it, yield to it, accept it, trust it, believe that it can do this for you, it will. Always your faith in the one perfect mind being present will be confirmed by your experience. You will find renewed vigor, renewed understanding, renewed health, renewed courage, and a deeper awareness that there is an infinite power ever present, no matter what the outer objectified condition presents to the mind that is blind. For that condition and the blind mind are one and the same. You are looking at the thoughts in your blind mind, accepting them as outer reality, reacting to them, and then being forced into a series of reactions, culminating in a final action which is completely based upon the acceptance of that which is not there. But in the one mind lived in, the whole pyramid of reaction to error that is not there is removed. We are not committed. We do not let the hand and the eye fool us. We do not let the jailer take us and cast us into prison. We do not remain in the prison of the mind. We do not serve a sentence there. We remain free of the idols of the mind, even of blindness. This is a complete condition, a condition such as few people on earth suffer from, comparatively, and therefore it includes just about every condition we can undergo as human beings. Blindness here, then, is the total state of the mortal mind. It is blind to Christ. It is anti-self. It is hypnotized. But divine mind is present. You need not rest in human mind. Do you believe that I, Christ mind, divine mind, can open your eyes? Yes, we believe, say the two blind men. You may remember last week it was noted that the two blind men stand for the faith and the will. The faith that spirit is present, and the will to live in that spirit as spiritual identity. These two or more gathered in my name. And there am I, the Christ mind in the midst of them, doing the work of the Father. When your faith and your will in spirit are united, I in the midst of you can show the glories of old, even to the miracle of opening the eyes to the vision of the soul. Every human ailment is included in this simple statement here by the Master. Do you believe I can do these things? Do you believe you are spirit? Do you believe God is your Father? Do you believe your Father is here now? Do you believe your Father has all power to maintain the perfection of his child? of his offspring, of his creation. Yes, I believe all this. Then you're not sick. You're well. The sickness was the illusion of the mind that did not believe this, but had another father, another creation, another source, another identity. If you believe these things, you're not sick. But if you're still sick, then you do not believe these things. And so we adjust the consciousness, deepen the understanding, reach that acceptance level which can say, I have faith in the allness of Spirit, the presence of Spirit, the omnipotence of Spirit to maintain a perfect spiritual creation, and there is no other. And there you stand, letting the false objectivization of the false mind dissolve itself. The new light removes the old darkness. You're standing still in identity, in the one perfect mind, which is ever present awaiting acknowledgement. And you are healed of the false belief in material, mortal selfhood. Their response to him when he said, do you believe? Yes, yea, Lord. Then touched he their eyes, saying, according to your faith be it unto you. And this was their release to the one perfect mind. The human mind was out of the way by faith in the presence of the Spirit of God and the will to live in and as that Spirit. And this is the meaning of he touched their eyes. The Christ mind sent light to the mind which had yielded its authority to the one perfect mind. The light of the one mind expresses as the vision, the knowing of that one mind. The inner spiritual awakening, which now becomes vision, is also the inner spiritual awakening which becomes the realization of Christ identity, the realization of divine sonship, illumination, the consciousness of the Christ universe around us as our own one selfhood. Now this happened in Capernaum. Their eyes were open. Jesus straightly charged them, saying, see that no man know it. Capernaum then is a state of transformation. Whenever Jesus goes down to Capernaum or up to Capernaum, usually up or into, Capernaum will indicate then a level of transformation taking place. Transformation of consciousness from my human mind to the acceptance of the one perfect mind present, which outpictures perfection only, and therefore all that can be here is perfection because the one perfect mind is here. The false idols of the human mind will see the imperfections that are within that human mind. But when I am transferred from that human mind and its beliefs to the purity of the one perfect mind accepted, then all of the beliefs of the false, limited human mind are recognized as just externalizations of the fabric of mortal mind. Never true, never created by the Father. No blindness created by the Father, no lack, no limitation, no lifespans either. What we have called birth and death and the interim between are merely periods of soul development, terms of development of the soul, which the mind sees and cannot embrace in the fullness of them. Now that's one healing. The union of faith and will to live in and accept the presence of the one perfect mind. Another healing takes place in Bethsaida. Another healing takes place in Jericho. And then the healing in John, which we're still to do today, is in Jerusalem. And so Capernaum, Bethsaida, Jericho, Jerusalem. Now Bethsaida is a fishing village. So it's the beginning of the teaching to the initiate, the little fish. It's not a healing of a blind man. That's just the outer appearance. It's an introduction to the inner initiation of the Spirit. And then in Jericho, after the man in Bethsaida is prepared, we come to Jericho, the moon city, the city of the senses. And there, that which is prepared in Bethsaida for the initiate comes to a higher degree of attainment as the sense consciousness is dispelled. In short, these healings are initiation keys. Finally, in Jerusalem, the New Jerusalem, is another healing showing Christ consciousness attained, or the release from blindness or mortality. Let's look at the one in Mark. This one is at 8:22. Again, it's a short one. 8:22. This would be the one in Bethsaida, the fishing village. And he cometh to Bethsaida. They bring a blind man unto him, and besought him to touch him. They bring to him a blind man. The blind man is being lifted into an inner awareness of Christ. They want him to touch him. They think the physical touch will do it. We know he will touch him by Christ awareness within. The Christ mind will come through. That will be the touch. He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of town, out of the old consciousness, out of the belief that I am a human being in a material world, out of the belief that this body made of flesh is me, out of town, out of world thought, out of the prevailing atmosphere of thought which saw this as a blind man. This is the preparation of the initiate into a higher level which will culminate as Christ consciousness, Spirit I am. When he'd spit in his eye, on his eyes and put his hands upon him, he asked if he saw aright. He looked up and said, I see men as trees walking. That's a very strange statement for us, because when you are in the acceptance of spirit, then a man and a tree are much the same. Both are material. You're not accepting life. You're accepting only the material appearances without giving them a sense of life. You're not saying the man is alive, the man is a divine creation, and the tree is a divine creation. You're seeing them as images. And one image is the same as another. This one is a tree image, that is a man image. Trees like men walking. Men like trees. It passed a state in this semi-state of accepting them as reality. The beginning of the understanding that there is one fabric making both a man and a tree, and that's world mind. Not God mind, world mind. The limited human mind becomes part of that acceptance of tree and man, which is you of a man, you of a tree. They're not seeing the spiritual man or the spiritual tree, which is the human condition. And finally, after he put his hands again upon his eyes, made him look up, he was restored and saw every man clearly. Now he could see the one invisible self as the self of all. He had been dehypnotized. Again, the healings in the Bible are all dehypnosis. Instead of healing a man's ear or eye or teeth or body of a condition, the mind of the man was released from its false concept, and the truth of the one perfect mind was revealed as the only present truth there. Dehypnosis was followed by the revelation of a perfected image. An image that had always been perfect, but was blocked by the false sense of the material conscious mind. Dehypnosis from the sense of mortality shows forth as what the world calls healings. Always the perfect is present in the perfect mind that is present, and blocked from our experience by the sense of my mind, your mind, his mind, where no such minds really exist. And he said, neither go into town nor tell it to any in the town. Stay out of mortal mind. Don't fall back into a human mind. Now in Mark again, this is 1046. Looks like we have a Chinese convention outside. I thought by now they'd pass, but they're staying. Now we come to Jericho, 1046. Each time so far we have seen a false state of mind removed, and a healing took place. I, Christ, became the mind of the first two blind men. I, Christ, became the mind of the second blind man. I, Christ, will always become the mind of the one who says, I am healed. I, Christ, becomes the mind of you, me, him, her, and we say, where did my problems go? Because I, Christ, can only objectify the divine image. I, Christ, is never blind to God. Come to Jericho, and as he went out of Jericho with his disciples and a great number of people blind, Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus, sat by the highway side begging. Sat begging. When it says they sat, that means spiritually they're stagnant. When it says they're begging, it means they're not sufficient in Christ, not self-sufficient. Begging always is a state of insufficiency in mortality. When the beggar receives Christ, he no longer sits, he usually leaps up, and he no longer begs because he's now self-sufficient in Christ. And so sat begging is a state of mortal mind in which we feel we're missing something, we lack something, and it's because we're sitting, we're stagnant. We're not open to the flow of the one perfect mind. And so we sit, begging, aware of our limitations and our wounds. Whereas right there, present in the one perfect mind, is the perfect self, waiting to be lived in if we will step out of the belief that this mind of mine is a true state of mind. Forget the condition. It is only an objectivization of a mind that is not a true state of mind. Rest in the one perfect mind. And lo and behold, from the mountaintop of truth, truth reveals itself and sets you free. Always, the one perfect mind is present. I can never leave you. I, the divine mind, am wherever you are. Rest in me, acknowledge me, with faith that I am present, with the will not to fall back into a second mind, a second self, a second life, and I will open your eyes. No longer will you be on the highway begging, needing, wanting, seeking, striving, for I reveal the finished kingdom where you are. When he heard it was Jesus of Nazareth, he begged, began to cry, and say, Jesus, thou son of David, have mercy on me. Many charged him that he should hold his peace, but he cried the more, a great deal, Thou son of David, have mercy on me. This is the acceptance of Christ within, turning to source, resting in the one perfect mind. Jesus stood still and commanded him to be called. They called a blind man, saying unto him, Be of good comfort, rise, he calleth thee. And now the mind that was pleading, have mercy on me, begins to accept. It doesn't have to plead anymore. It simply has to rise, to accept. Why, what am I pleading for? The Christ mind is my own mind. The one perfect mind here is the only mind there is. All I have to do is get out of my mind, which wanted to plead, and accept this one perfect mind here is the perfect expression of God. You rise to that level and rest. And he, casting away his garment, rose and came to Jesus. Your garment, then, that you cast away is the mind which had separated you from the one perfect mind, the hypnotized or dream mind of man, with its complete world conditions. That garment you cast aside. In another place it's called rolling away the stone. Here it's called casting aside the garment. And when you realize that the entire field of psychology is probing that one mind which is unaware of the one perfect mind, then it must be seen that all psychology is still working within the dream consciousness. That's why there's no hope in it. It cannot release the dream. It changes from one dream to another. It changes from a mind that is doing something bad to a mind that is doing something better, but it's still a mortal mind. Again, psychology has introduced to us the idea of the unconscious. Somebody gave me a book on it the other day, and I was very surprised to see that the author of this particular talk, usually in order to include God in the conversation, would say, whether you call it God or the unconscious. And therefore, it was the author's belief that what we call God was really not God, but was the unconscious. Now that is true about religions. What religions call God is the unconscious, but they don't know it's the unconscious. But the Christ teaching doesn't call God what psychology calls the unconscious. Religions do, but not Christ. What psychology has discovered to be the unconscious, which is what religions call God, both are the identical mortal mind. The unconscious is the unconscious mortal mind, or the universal world mind, which is the unconscious of man. And it's also what religions worship and call God. But whenever you hear that unconscious, you're hearing about the universal world mind. And Christ took us beyond the universal world mind. Christ took us beyond the unconscious. Because God is not unconscious. Christ took us to God. The minute you say God or the unconscious, you're saying that God is unconscious, which means only one thing, that you are unconscious. Because the mind that is asleep in the dream is unconscious of God. Unconscious of the one perfect infinite mind ever present. And that one perfect infinite mind ever present is the only God there is. It is not the unconscious of man. That's the counterfeit world mind, which is the unconscious of man, which is being probed by psychology. You probe the counterfeit world mind and think you've got something, and you're stuck for life. You're imprisoned in a fable. And so man draws from this vast reservoir of nothing and gets nothing. He draws from the world dream and makes it an individual dream. Christ took us right through that, out of that blindness, out of the blindness of psychology and religion, out of the blindness of materia medica, out of all of the blindness of the world mind, which becomes the individual human sense of mind, out of mortality. Now in this third healing here, you have a man being taken out of the sense mind, sense consciousness. He is removed from the unconscious, which had been making him blind. Nobody probed the unconscious, they removed him from it. And so we come finally to the fourth healing. Now, these were states in initiation, preparation, purification, attainment of higher levels. Jerusalem, where the temple was a very specifically chosen place for one reason. Naturally, you'd expect religion to heal, and it would heal in its temples. But here's a healing outside the temple. Terrible thing, of course, because once you heal outside the temple, who's going to have to go inside the temple? And that was the reason for the outrage. How can you heal outside our temple? It's impossible. You must be a faker. But the message for us is, the kingdom of God is within you. You don't get your healing in a church. You get your healing in the one perfect mind of the Father, which reveals perfection on the holy ground where you stand. And so you don't have to petition the church to say, heal me. You don't have to tithe. You don't have to grovel. You don't have to say, have mercy on me. You don't have to plead. You simply have to be aware that the one perfect mind of God is present and you're in church. That's your temple. And then you don't need materia medica. You don't need psychology. You don't need metaphysics. You don't need anyone on this earth. Why? Because the one perfect mind where you are is forever perfect, forever maintaining its perfect creation. Now, because the mind of man will not accept this, we don't argue with the mind of man. The condition of that mind is that it's enslaved to its own beliefs, to its own limited experiences. It will do such strange things as turn upon the perfect mind of the Father and accuse it of being a faker. And here it will call the beggar a sinner. It will tell him that he's outright a liar. Where does he get off trying to pull the wool over their eyes and saying that he was blind from birth? Where does he get off saying that he was in the streets somewhere outside the temple and a man healed him of blindness? And where do his parents get off saying that this happened? Who ever heard of such a thing? And so finally it's revealed that the real blindness is not the blind man whose eyes are open, but the mind of man which refuses to acknowledge that it happened, or that it's possible. That mind being committed to the fact that you must come into a place called a temple. You must come and worship in that temple. You must do many things. And always behind this was the idea that the blind man, of course, was that way because of divine punishment. How could the punishment be removed so quickly, and for what? He had shown no atonements. He hadn't repented. He hadn't done anything to say that he was sorry for whatever he had done. The divine punishment hadn't been removed. How could he have been healed of it? And so obviously the man who healed him was a faker, and he was probably a faker himself for pretending all these years that he was blind. Now we say, how could the Pharisees be so stupid? But he's not talking about Pharisees. He's talking about your mind and my mind. The human mind, which thwarted at one turn, will shift to another. He's telling us that the human mind is conditioned to self-deception. You would have thought that the Hebrews in that day were seeking the salvation of man. But here it's being shown that even though that's what we thought the human mind was seeking, it is not capable of seeking that. All the human mind is capable of seeking is its own self-justification, its own self-righteousness. Whatever your human mind feels is right, that's what you're willing to fight to protect. And you may be under the illusion that you're willing to let go of your conditioned beliefs if some better beliefs come along. But if they directly contradict your way of life, your committed opinions, you have no capacity to go outside of those, and in some way or other your mind tries to justify itself for doing it this way. He's revealing an innate quality of the human mind, that even in the face of the evidence of blindness healed, it would not accept it because, as far as it knew, blindness can only be healed by God lifting the punishment that had caused the blindness in the first place. And certainly no one who wasn't in the temple could be chosen by God. So conditioned is the mind that it can only see what it knows. Always, of course, behind this is to break down our faith in the mind of man and build up our faith in the mind of God. Once we know that the human mind, even in us, in ourselves, is so built that it has no capacity to see outside of its own knowledge, and that its knowledge is inevitably separated from God, mind, being, matter cannot perceive spirit. This is a permanent condition of the human mind. And when we recognize this permanent fallacy of the mind, we won't try to circumvent this knowledge by saying, well, my mind is different. We will accept it as a condition of the human mind, which we can never overcome except by releasing that mind. The Pool of Siloam was mentioned before in the Bible in a different way. You remember the story of Naaman the leper. You find it in 2 Kings chapter 5. He was a captain in the Syrian army. He was a victorious warrior, very important to his king, but he also had leprosy. And so his king said, well, I hear from someone who works for your own wife, a maid there, a maid servant. She tells us that in Samaria, in the kingdom of Israel, that's when Samaria was still part of that kingdom, that they have a prophet there, and he can heal you of leprosy. And so, because you're important to me, I'm going to send you to that king and tell him to have you healed. So the king of Syria wrote the king of Israel. And he said, I have this great warrior here. I'm going to send him down there, and I want you to see that he gets healed of his leprosy. Of course, there'll be a lot of transferring of gold and silver and all the accoutrements that go with that kind of a royal contract. So the king of Israel said, well, now, whatever got into this man's mind? I don't know anything about healing anybody. Who does he think I am, God? And he was about to rip up this letter from the king of Syria when Elisha said, why don't you have that warrior come down so they can see there's a prophet in Israel? So Naaman came down. He had a chariot drawn by horses. He had his servants with him. He was an important man, and he expected to be greeted by an important man who would look up to the heavens and make some great declaration, maybe slap Naaman on the forehead and say, you're well. What happened? A messenger came out. The messenger said, I have a message from Elisha. He says for you to go and dip yourself in the Jordan 7 times. And when you do, you'll be all free of your leprosy. This wasn't at all what the human mind expected. So Naaman was very angry. He hadn't had a royal welcome. It hadn't happened at all as he had expected. Besides, back in Damascus, they had their own water. A couple of rivers there he felt were at least as good as the Jordan. And so he started home, very angrily. But his servants prevailed upon him and said, now what have you got to lose? You made this trip. Surely the man who gave this message to you had something in mind. Why don't you obey? And so you see symbolically, you're seeing the man who's trying to turn to Christ. The mind wants to turn, but it's reluctant. It wants the thing to happen within its own preconceived pattern of thought. It can't just say, I surrender, you tell me. But when he does surrender and bathes in the Jordan 7 times, that's the surrender to Christ. Out of the human sense of mind, and of course that's the end of his leprosy. Now that bathing in the Jordan 7 times is a symbol which is later used by Jesus when he says to the blind man here, now that I've joined spittle with clay and rubbed it, anointed on your eyes, wash it off in the pool of Siloam. Same as saying bathe 7 times in the Jordan. The pool of Siloam, then, is where you and I are learning to bathe. 7 times. Until we are totally free of the sense of mortality. Until the body of clay becomes another body. Not the old body of clay, of mortal clay, but the new spiritual body is formed as you bathe in the pool of Siloam. The pool of Siloam is the Word of God expressing in you. I think in Nehemiah the prophet it's mentioned. Only it's spelt with an H at the end instead of an M. It's called the pool of Siloam. And this is after Jerusalem has been sacked. This is in the rebuilding of Jerusalem. And that pool is in the king's court that descends from the steps that come down from the city of David. All of the symbolism to tell you that the seventh heaven and the pool of Siloam are one and the same. The highest consciousness. When you're one with the infinite, you're in the pool of Siloam. And the pool of Siloam has become the title of the book, Realization of Oneness. The pool of Siloam is that which is sent from the one infinite mind. When you bathe in the pool of Siloam, you're not in human thought, you're in the thought of the one infinite mind, and that objectifies as your healing, or the harmony of your experience. The pool of Siloam is divine thought, which now becomes visible as divine action where you stand. It is sent from the Father. When you come out of human thought, you're in the pool of Siloam. You're in that which is sent from the Father, divine thought. And when you're in divine thought, you are one with the infinite mind. In that oneness, the one power of the infinite functions as your being. Bathe in the pool of Siloam. Rest in the knowledge that the perfect divine mind here is thinking the perfect divine thought here now. Be still and let it be your thought without taking thought. And it will wash away from your eye the false sense of blindness to the truth that the kingdom of God is here in all its perfection right this moment. We're coming into the clear crystal water of one mind. And that will bring us into the realization of one self. Jesus always said, "The Father sent me." That which is sent of the Father is divine thought expressing as. Divine thought was expressing as Christ Jesus. He was sent. He was divine thought appearing. He was the perfect divine image. Sent. He was one with the infinite. Now these 4 different blind healings then are not about blind people, although they're the instrument for the secret teaching. They're about the blindness of the human mind, which must be released in order for the light of the infinite mind to function you as the child of God, the offspring of the divine light. Every little tremor of fear and doubt and worry, false belief, is a second mind. A mind that can only behold the divine light through a glass darkly. And that's why we are not resisting anymore these illusions of evil, not reacting. One perfect mind. Here now, accept it, be still. I'm bathing in the pool of Siloam. Actually following the instructions of the Master. Bathe in the pool of Siloam. Divine thought where you are. And it descends like a staircase from the city of David, which is Christ consciousness. The city of David, the seventh heaven, the staircase, each day and each night coming down, down, down to this level of human selfhood. One flow of spiritual truth. Now while it is day, the period between birth and death is the preparation for the soul universe. That is the moment of purification. And then there will be no night. There will be no period between death and birth, preparing for re-entry to a mind universe, because it will not be necessary. The light of the world coming through, the divine mind expressing as you, releases you from the need to enter night as a second preparation for a return to this world. The preparations by day are in the corporeal body. The preparations by night are without a corporeal body. Those are the cycles. In the pool of Siloam, we're preparing by day. And when you are released from mortal mind, there will be no night. I think we'll take a short intermission now. The one thing the human mind is not prepared for is life without end. It's just something it can't contemplate. And so it continues to act in the belief that that which is life with an ending can be life. The human mind thinks that the life span is life, and it lives within that sphere, trying to make a better lifespan. But the lifespan isn't life. The blindness revealed here is the nature of mortality, that mortality itself is a state of blindness, in which we picture second selves made of flesh, where only the self of spirit is. And this is to alert us to the separation of that mind from reality, so that the good minds and the bad minds, the brilliant ones and the stupid ones, are all recognized as separated from reality, no matter what picture they show forth. They are going to see second selves of flesh, and spirit can never create flesh. That mind is going to see conditions that have no existence, conditions of matter, and spirit can never create matter. And so the mind has got to reject that which says to the mind, everything you have ever believed is a lie. And the mind that rejects the truth continues to imprison man in a body of flesh, because it will not accept that life eternal is the only life, and it is not lived in a body of flesh. The blindness that is called mortality ended for Paul at one day. He was in a state of blindness with eyes that could see bodies of flesh. He was blind, but he didn't know it. Well, there they are. And those very people that he was attacking were breaking the law as he saw it of his God. But he was blind. They weren't there. And then in a moment he became physically blind. But that physical blindness was the awakening. It was becoming blind to the real blindness of mortality. And when the blindness was over and the light came through, he no longer saw bodies of flesh. He was no longer blind. The mortal blindness was removed, and the Christ reality was accepted. In other words, the light of Christ had broken the world mind which functioned as Saul. Just as the light of Christ had broken the world mind which functioned as the blind people in these healings. And removes the blindness of mortality, with all the conditions of mortality included in that blindness, and restores us to the eyes, the ears, the sense of touch, smell and the taste, the senses of the soul. Now look at this statement by Joel, and you see how far we're coming now, because Joel tells us here in No And that dehypnotism is a state of consciousness that sees that which actually is. It's the ability to see, to taste, to touch, to hear, and to smell reality. The ability to see sin not as sin, disease not as disease, but rather to be able to separate these from the person, to realize we're dealing with a false appearance produced by the belief of a selfhood apart from God. And the seat of that false appearance is the mind that perceives it. Now, once the blindness is removed, even if it has to make us physically blind to remove it, it's still good. It is awakening us from the false ego and bringing us an inner light which will reveal the non-mortal reality, and eyes that will see not what the world sees, but through what the world sees. Now you can see Christ seeing through what the world sees. You can hear Joel speaking of seeing through what the world sees. And therefore, we will see through what the world sees. But first, we have to bypass this mind. This mind takes the Pharisees, is the human mind, and it takes the blind man now who was healed. And even though you have had healings, that's the point of this, even though you have seen healings, there still come times when you're faced with a new condition. And everything you've learned about all of the old conditions that disappeared in the face of the inner Christ of you is forgotten. You panic all over again. Why? Because even though the blind man was healed, the mind says, what about everything I know? What about my total experience up to now? I've had a few isolated healings. So what? I've also lived these many years, and I've seen a lot of other things that weren't healed. And frankly, I never saw a blind man healed like that. And so the mind says, impossible. The mind says, I never saw bread falling out of the sky, impossible. And I've read a lot about healings, and I've seen some, but they're not the general rule. They're the exceptions. I can't live with those exceptions. And so the mind in you turns from Christ, and it even accuses the one who is blind of doing something to falsify this evidence. In other words, the mind in you is still Thomas. Even though it is seen, it is still bewildered. And here's a funny twist. It has believed the man was blind up to the point that he was healed. But when he's healed, it doesn't believe he was blind. The man is blind because my eyes see he's blind. But now that he's healed and my eyes see he can see, I can't believe my eyes. Something is wrong. The senses will always pervert and distort the evidence. Now, you're told to do what this blind man did in a certain way. They brought to the Pharisees him that aforetime was blind. It was the Sabbath day when Jesus had made the clay and opened this man's eyes. Now the Pharisees asked him how he had received his sight. Their motive wasn't so that they could go out and do the same, but to prove that something had been faked. The mind cannot accept the divine activity outside of its own limited mental scope. Well, he said he put clay on my eyes and they're washed, and I saw. Some of the Pharisees said, now, this man is not of God, because he keepeth not the Sabbath. The healing did not indicate he was of God, because a man of God certainly wouldn't break the law of the Sabbath. And so Jesus was not of God. This is the Christ of God, which the mind says is not of God. And so the mind refuses to accept the Christ because it had found some little flaw in the work which did not obey man-made laws or concepts. He's alerting us to the tricks of our mind for getting out of the responsibility of accepting our own spiritual self. And others said, now how can a man that is a sinner do such miracles? In other words, he's a sinner because he healed on the Sabbath. And this may sound silly to us now, but when you sit down with your own mind, you'll find that it behaves in just that fashion. It's all deep within us that we find all of the reasons and excuses for not accepting our spiritual self. And that's what this is all about. You cannot accept the perfection of yourself as a spiritual being. Your mind says it's impossible. Or even if it's possible, maybe not in this incarnation. But here's a blind man from birth healed in one incarnation. In the same incarnation that he's born blind, he's healed. In one incarnation. There's a point there. We don't have to do it the third time around from now, or the fourth or fifth, but in one incarnation. Once we're not a divided consciousness with a mind that says, well, you know, I really am not very far advanced in this. Or I don't expect to have the Christ consciousness within the next 10 years. I couldn't do it that quickly. You see, it's present now. The mind of God is present right this instant. It's not a matter of 10 years from now. It's right now. And the mind says, no, I just couldn't possibly begin to do that within 10 years, and yet here it is now. The mind is turning away from the now Christ. That's the point of this. And even as we talk about it, you find your mind is turning away from the now Christ in some subtle fashion that you don't seem to be able to control. And this is explaining the automatic method whereby mind turns away from Christ even while you think you're trying to find Christ. Some people love the pursuit. They're afraid of getting there, because getting there is a new responsibility. But you must accept the nowness of Christ, not the tomorrowness. And that means the nowness of the perfection of Christ. And therefore the imperfection is the way you reject the nowness of the perfection of Christ. Now, while that person is falling off of the hill, now is Christ perfect and present there. The capacity to accept the nowness of the perfection of Christ in spite of whatever might appear. And to be living in that consciousness, in the nowness of the perfection of Christ. And then that mind can squirm and wriggle and find excuses and take the blind man and treat him as a criminal. Cross-examine him and put him through the third degree to confirm and verify that which is obvious the man can see and he couldn't before. Why not just accept? Christ is present. Something has done this great healing work. Something that did it then is present to do it now. But they debate, because the mind is divided. If it accepts this miracle, it has to admit whatever it knew is false. It's protecting its own limitations. It cannot go beyond the boundaries which it has already accepted. So it lives in its own prison of past experience. So now they come again to the blind man. They're determined to break down his story. The mind wants to live in its own comfortable niche without straining into another level. What sayest thou of him that opened thine eyes? Poor blind man won't cooperate. He just says he's a prophet. But the Jews did not believe concerning him that he had been blind and received his sight, until they called the parents of him that had received his sight. And then they said to the parents, is this your son whom ye say was blind? And then how does he see now? And the parents, of course, are kind of fearful. Public opinion has let it be known that if anyone declares himself to be the Christ, he'll be stoned to death. They're not about to say this man must be the Christ of God for having done this. And so it is shown that within you, still clinging to the past, to your bondage to heredity, the mind of you still lingers with the thought, why, it really couldn't have happened, I guess. I see it happen, but it's hard to believe it. The mind still vacillates. You've still got the false sense of heredity lingering in that mind which has not broken away from human birth and accepted spirit which can never be born into humanhood. All these little facets of the mind are reminding us of the limitations that we have fallen into, and which we do not have the energy or conviction or integrity to break out of, while they happen around us automatically, even unknown to our conscious mind, that we're held into these things. So he's awakening all of the levels of the conscious and unconscious mind to the tricks of the mind that hold it in bondage. And the parents answer, we know that this is our son and that he was born blind. We know not by what means he now seeth, or who has opened his eyes, but he is of age. Why don't you ask him? He'll speak for himself. And so the parents cannot testify. Your heredity cannot testify the truth of you. Your heredity, humanly, is not the truth of you, and it cannot testify completely in the truth of you. That's another way the Bible is saying here, we're not born of woman, and if we are, we're not the Son of God. The Son of God is not the son of woman. The son of human parents is not the son of God. You cannot be both. Even the parents cannot testify truly about the Son. Only the Christ in you can testify truly about you. So, these words spake his parents because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had agreed already that if any man did confess he was Christ, he should be put out of the synagogue. Therefore said his parents, he is of age, ask him. Again, they call the man that was blind. Now this is a vendetta, you can see by now, by the mind. It's determined to prove that whatever was done outside that human mind couldn't be true. Whatever was done outside the church couldn't be true. The human mind says, I am the authority here and there is no other. I will not accept an authority outside of my human mind. That's the nature of the mind that is blind. Now they ask him to praise God. Give God the praise. We know this man is a sinner. And the blind man says, well, whether he be a sinner or no, I know not. But I do know one thing, whereas I was blind, now I see. Now they are blinded by unbelief. That's the human mind. But he who was blind had his eyes opened by faith. A blind beggar can see through Christ And those who think they're seeing through mind cannot see the truth. You see how topsy-turvy our world is in mind? This is the condition, the perversion of mind. It's false belief that it sees, whereas it doesn't, and yet a blind man learns to see by receiving Christ. Here, the mind of men, typified by the Jews, is shown to be blind, and the mind of the blind man is shown to be opened and awake to truth, released into another mind. How did he open thine eyes? Determined. The mind wants to know. It's going to get to the bottom of this quackery. He answered, well, I told you. Ye did not hear. Wherefore would ye hear it again? Will ye be his disciples? He's questioning the motive of these men who want to know how the healing took place. They want to know so they can disprove it. Then they reviled him and said, thou art his disciple, but we are Moses' disciple. They do not know that Christ spoke through Jesus and through Moses. And they do not understand Moses. They think of him as a man. They do not understand Jesus. They think of him as a man. And therefore they are not Christ conscious, and the mind of man is incapable of being Christ conscious. This is a permanent condition of the human mind. It cannot be Christ conscious. This teaching will not let you fall back into the mistaken belief that your mind can become Christ conscious. Because it is only the crucifixion of that mind that is acceptable if you are to attain the level of Christ consciousness. Your mind is so blind, it cannot even see a blind man healed. Now, we know God spake unto Moses, as for this fellow we know not whence he is. The man answered and said unto them, why, herein is a marvelous thing. Ye know not from whence he is, and yet he hath opened mine eyes. The human mind does not know where Christ is, and yet Christ has opened the eyes of a blind beggar. Now ye know that God heareth not sinners, but if any man be a worshipper of God and doeth his will, he heareth. And since the world began, was it not heard that any man opened the eyes of one that was born blind? And if the man were not of God, he could do nothing. Now who opened the eyes then of the blind man? Not the Pharisees, not the mind of man, not religion, not belief in God. Only the Christ received within the blind man's mind. The mind which had been crucified was out of the way, and Christ came through as a realization from the divine mind where the blind man stood. The human mind rolled away. The light comes through the blind man as the Christ idea. It could not be done through all of Judaism. It cannot be done through the religions of this world. It can be done only by Christ in you. That's laying it right where the truth is. Only Christ in you can perform the miracle of opening your inner eye. And so the cross-examining mind must be put aside. All of the questions by that inner trial lawyer must be put aside. We come right down to the simple faith of a blind man saying, "Open mine eyes." To whom? To Christ within. Right to source. To Christ within you say, "Open mine eyes." With the confidence that Christ being present, being one with the Father, all that can happen is that your eyes are opened. And then what do you see? You see God's kingdom. You see with the eyes and ears and the touch and the knowledge of the soul. You're dehypnotized. Now, if you feel on the verge of this great revelation that you can look out and see the kingdom, whereas before you could only see the world, that you can reach and touch the kingdom, whereas before you could only touch the world, that is what this should be leading you to, the awareness of that possibility. We're just a minute away, it would seem, is something ready to open all that had been invisible, and there you see what human eyes do not see. That is where we should be at this point. On the threshold. And the way to cross the threshold is to turn away from the human mind. Otherwise, this is what happens. The beggar says, if this man were not of God, he could do nothing. But they answer and say, thou wast altogether born in sin, and thou dost teach us. And they cast him out. The truth comes to you, and you cast it out. Why? Because it isn't easy. It isn't easy at all. It's much easier to sit back in the sense of a false authority called the mind, with no strain and no strife, and go out there and slug it out with your competitors, than it is to take that mind, put it on the shelf, and rest in the divine, knowing I have no competition. The Father is the only self. Don't cast that beggar out. He was telling the truth. Christ opened his eyes. The same Christ that opens the eyes of those who will turn from the Pharisaic mind in each of us, which keeps us in bodies of clay. The blind are still blind in this world. The blind healings have not opened their eyes. But they have not really studied the blind healings, or the healings at all. They have looked at them like a Pharisee, and they have, with word of mouth, said, that's very nice, and I'll come to our church and we'll pray together. But Christ in you is that church. Christ in you showed that blindness, whether it's of the eyes or of the human sense of life, cannot continue You cannot continue sitting by the highway begging when infinity is ever present to come through the door of your consciousness. Dehypnosis leads to the realization of no and. No and. No spiritual you and sickness. No spiritual you and disease. No spiritual you and any of the distresses of the world. Only a human you and. When there's a human you, there's and everything. When there's a spiritual you, there's and nothing. Only infinity. In the and of the world are the opposites. You break the law of the opposites. You dehypnotize not by the resolutions of your human mind, but by the willingness to let the divine mind live your life. If you've had your glimmerings of that divine vision, divine hearing, divine touch, those previews are telling you that all of the infinite self is present here now. You couldn't have had those glimmerings without it being here now in the fullness. Mortality is blindness. The healing of the belief in mortality is the Christ mission. There is no God and mortality. We're going into chapter 10 of John. I don't think we can leave no and yet. We'll have to stay with that. There is you, the Spirit of God, and no and. And if you're accepting anything that is in the condition called mortality, these conditions must continue to besiege you until you are awakened to the fact that mortality is not a divine creation and therefore has no existence. It only exists because there's a human mind there. It is a condition that exists within the human mind. And where the human mind seems to be, it isn't there. I think that is probably the meaning here in Joel. If we continue to look through our eyes at the people of the world, all we shall ever see are human beings. Sometimes good, sometimes bad. That's the human picture. Sometimes good, sometimes evil. And that's what we shall always see, hear, taste, touch, and smell with our five physical senses. The only way to be dehypnotized is to quiet the physical senses. You see how the physical senses and the human mind are one? To be still inside, then spiritual awareness will reverse the truth of being that enables us to see that which is not visible, to hear that which is not audible, and to know that which is not knowable with the human senses. Namely, Christ, here I am. Well, I think our blindness stories here have served their purpose for the moment. God is not blind. Christ is not blind. Spirit is not blind. God does not create blindness. God does not create sickness. God does not create problems. God does not make mistakes. The allness of God, the allness of the infinite mind, the ever-presence of the infinite mind everywhere, is a permanent guarantee that only the creation of the infinite mind exists. And in that creation there is only perfection. The moment you have accepted an imperfection, no matter how small, you're not in the infinite mind. You have fallen into another mind. You have fallen into the human sense mind. And the imperfection you are accepting is not where you are seeing it, it is in your mind, your false sense of mind. All around you is perfection. To live in that perfection is to fast from this human sense of mind, which does not see the perfection and is blind to it. You might this week go through your concordance and find some indication of where to look for knowledge about the one perfect mind. And build your week around finding biblical passages to support the knowledge in you that there is one perfect mind and no other. And its creation is all that is here. This perfect creation of the one perfect mind can never be tarnished, can never fall. It is the indestructible present kingdom of reality. And all heart attacks, all ulcers, all of the things we call the problems of the world are not happening. For there is one perfect mind maintaining its perfect creation. And the moment you accept anything as happening, which is imperfect, you have gone back into a dream consciousness. And you have, like the Pharisee, refused to accept that there is one perfect mind and one perfect creation present and no other. We've only done about 4 or 5 pages of no end, so let's continue with it. One perfect mind should be studied not through something you look in a book to find, but something you work out creatively within yourself. Finding your passages, looking them up, studying them, working with them, finding places in various books of Joel about one perfect mind, really moving into everything you can find that will tell you more about one perfect mind, until it's made such an impression on you that you're not blind to it, but awake to it. And then you know, wherever you are, the one perfect mind is. Its creation is present where it is, perfect now. Let's end with a meditation on this one perfect mind. It doesn't know Uncle Harry or Aunt Susie. It is no respecter of persons. It doesn't know human conditions, and when a human condition or person flows through you now, You're not in the one perfect mind. You're still in a state of diluting the pure truth of being. There must be a vacuum, a peace, the texture of love itself. For there is only one perfect creation everywhere. You can hold no one in bondage to the thought that there is an imperfect anything. The one perfect mind must find its perfect counterpart in your perfect thought, so that you're clearing out all that is imperfect. You'll notice how you stumble over that because the mind wants to hang on to something it thinks is imperfect that it has to solve. You've got to clear that out of there. There's nothing imperfect that your mind has to solve. That's a false world concept. There is only one perfect mind. When you wholeheartedly accept that, all the Pharisees within you will have been sent home. It's a good exercise. I think Socrates practiced it under tutorship from Plato, and he called it a catharsis or a loosening of unbelief. All that was untrue was released in this mental catharsis, just resting. He didn't call it meditation, but that's what it was. One perfect mind. Well, next week is Mother's Day, finally. I knew it would come. We'll see you soon.
I hope you enjoy this spiritual audio. Like, share and subscribe for more.